I'm representing the BRL today, which is a joint venture between the two universities in Bristol. So the UWE, which is where the BRL is based, and the UOB, University of Bristol itself. So we do all sorts of robotics. We've got air robotics, we've got UAVs, got a flight arena, got a whole house built in there for assisted living robotics. We've got a Range Rover at the back near the garages where we can kit that out with self-driving technology. We've got a self-driving bus, we've got swarm robotics, all sorts of things. And then tucked away in a little corner is our little group, which, as Rachel said, is the neurorobotics group, where we're trying to bridge the divide between, or trying to take what we can learn in neuroscience, apply that to robotics, and also use robotics as a platform to explore neuroscience. So for those that aren't familiar already, I've spared everyone in the room a demo of artificial neural networks. I'm assuming everyone here is hopefully familiar with what an artificial neural network is. So just briefly, what are we talking about when we talk about spiky neural networks, which are the kind of more neuroscientifically plausible cousin of SNNs? So we look first at the real neuron, right? The actual sort of biological entity that, got about 100 billion, I think, in our heads, help us think, create our minds. We've got this absolute mess of, it's a true hallmark of biology, right? It's an absolute mess. The image I'm showing you here is just a microscope image of the dendritic tree of a neuron. So just the big web of connections that allow neurons to talk to one another. And to get an idea of the scale of connectivity, every one of those little nodules is a synaptic boson, where these neurons are trying to connect to each other with varying strengths, varying responses, a network across the entire brain. So it's a very messy structure. Like I said, there's thousands of connections for each neuron. So of course, you times that by about 100 billion, you get a very large number of things to take into account when it comes to modeling. And there's loads of things that we could, as modelers, when we're building these artificial models, we could use. We could look into the actual physical structure of the dendrites, this kind of tree structure, which has a kind of, branching dependency. And where you connect, you'll get different priorities of signals. We could look at things like the thermodynamics of it. You could look at how the voltage changes across the whole cell. But we need to cut this down somehow. So when we use these as models, we're instead modeling them quite simply in the work we've done here. So rather than doing I noticed this is, how do I hide this?
Go to the minimize button.
This one, yeah?
Yeah.
Sorry, I hadn't even turned my head that far. I hadn't realised that was there. Apologies. So if we look at this is a sort of this is a diagram of the stereotype action potential. So this is what happens inside the neuron when it receives, or the state of the neuron as it is receiving a signal over time. So these are physical systems, right? They have dynamics based on the time course, and normally a neuron will be held at about minus 70 millivolts, right? This is done by ion exchange proteins that keep it at that nice steady minus 70. Now this thing here, which is a stimulus, that's when the neurons received inputs, and these will accumulate over time. Now, if at all possible, because this neuron's a living system, living cell, it will try to maintain that minus 70 sort of equilibrium homeostasis. It doesn't want to spike if at all possible, because that causes it to then have to expend a lot of energy. But eventually, if it gets a large enough input, or a large enough input over a particular time window, that will then cause it to spike. So you get this, once it hits the threshold of minus 55, so every excitatory input is trying to push it closer and closer towards that zero voltage. When it hits that, then it then rapidly starts to depolarize. So other channels open, ions flood in, ions flood out, and then it overcompensates both directions. And that sends a propagating signal down the axon to whatever it's connected to. So when we're modeling this, like I said before, there's loads of things we could model from this. For the work we've done, we've just used simple leaky integrating fire neurons. And these don't even simplify as much as this diagram does. So when we're working with these models, we simply look at when that voltage hits the threshold, that modeled voltage hits that minus 55 threshold, and then that's counted as, right, that's a spike. That's one transmission or one pulse of that neuron communicating. So all this complexity, never mind everything you saw on the previous slide, just gets decomposed down into this on the left, which is, did this neuron spike at this particular time? But it's quite remarkable what you can get just from using this information. When did I spike and at what time can get you an awful lot of work done in terms of computation. And we'll go into some examples in a second. But just to sort of address, to both give credit and also address sort of always the elephant in the room with these talks is, okay, but we're talking about using spiking neural networks. Why not just use deep learning, right? It's tried and tested. We've got several examples here that work incredibly well in their domains. So, you know, YOLO, I think that's V3 running, which again, even by now is out of date. But you can do, you know, real-time bounding box localization in an image. It can tell you what's in an image and where it is in the image, which again, sort of 10 years ago was unheard of. Obviously, everyone's favorite, ChatGPT, right? We can now bring about a sort of an actual kind of search engine in the sci-fi sense, right? Not in the Google sense where you search by keywords. Now we've got a system where you can give it a prompt and it will reply to you with, you know, it can write an essay for you, it can find legal precedents for you, it can do all sorts of things, these large language models. And then, of course, you know, anything with score, like a game, can be then optimized, things like AlphaGo. So we don't need these spiking networks to do interesting things, but there is a reason to consider maybe using these instead of deep learning. So one thing that holds a lot of these larger networks back, and I'm thinking of ChatGPT in particular, is they do take an enormous amount of energy to train. So unlike our brains, which, you know, famously, you know, you can eat a sandwich and you're kind of good to go for the rest of the day, right? Your brain has a very low energy cost, even though it's got 100 billion neurons. Something like ChatGPT, it needs an entire data center to kind of train itself on, to aggregate all this training data. It needs lots of human experts sat there to actually curate the data that feeds into it. So even if this is sort of meant to be artificial intelligence, there is actually a lot of human intelligence, or arguably, you know, spiky neural networks, bringing the intelligence into these systems. And part of the reason it's so energy intensive is because it's a very inefficient training process, right? So, you know, we know backpropagation doesn't exist in the brain. There have been many attempts to find it. We cannot nail this down to any particular circuit. And it needs to be constantly fed this data over and over and over again. Whereas we know biological systems can do sort of one-shot or even zero-shot learning on certain problems. And then perhaps more of a philosophical point, arguably, and I put that carefully because you can, as I said, there's been a lot of good progress with deep learning. But arguably, it hasn't really approached the original goals of the idea of artificial intelligence, which, and apologies, obscured slightly, but the idea of can we capture every aspect of intelligence so precisely that we can stimulate it with a machine? And I think in a lot of areas, you know, particularly like things like semantic intelligence, looking at counterfactuals, or, you know, very rapid responses, very low energy responses to things, like we do as living organisms, we're still, you know, we're still a fair way off that goal. So my sort of little pitch is to say, can we use this emergent field of neuromorphics to make up for some of these shortfalls? And one of the reasons this is so timely is because just like deep learning was accelerated massively in about sort of the 2010s by co-opting GPUs, which previously were just used for things like, you know, 3D rendering and gaming and the like, you know, this was co-opted with GPU compute to run these deep learning training cycles on very, very, very quickly, which then lets you rapidly prototype and build these systems very quickly. Now we're seeing neuromorphic technology come online, which helps us do the same with spiking neural networks, right? So they're starting to get a lot of industry interest in a similar way to the deep learning system. So other brands are available, but the Intel Luigi chip, right, is a sort of a CPU for spiking neural networks, which is currently available. It's currently on version 2, I believe. But you can have access to it as a lab and run spiking hardware pretty much natively on your own, like, artificial brain. We've also got simulators like Nest, we've got Brian, we've also got Sussex Gen, that all exist to do what I just described, but you can do it all with conventional hardware in simulation. And then lastly, so projects that Rachel and myself are both working on until very recently, the Human Brain Project has given us all these publicly available brain atlases that we can use as inspiration for these networks, right? So this is, for example, a, you know, sort of fully labeled rat brain, that you can look into, you look at the connectivity, take it at almost any level of detail you want, and then that's a very rich storehouse of information you can use as inspiration for your spiking neural networks. So that's sort of the background, but what you're all here for is the neurorobotics. So how have we used these neuromorphic technologies to within robotics, and how have we kind of merged all these together in working systems? So this is the video I was worried about. Right, it's not working. So I prepared. Right, here we go. Right, so I'll just talk over the video. That'll probably be right. Yeah, honestly, I can. Yeah, I'd turn the laptop around, but that wouldn't be any good for people on Zoom. Any idea for a quick fix, or I'll just move on otherwise?
Is this video showing you?
It's showing my laptop, and it's saying I'm sharing the screen. So
Mirroring the screen.
That's a good question.
This is an amazing thing. IT and AI are very different things. We're trying to build AI when we can't get computers to do what we ask them to.
Yeah.
We should go to the display settings.
What is it? Is it that? Is it? Yeah, come on. There we go. So if I'm duplicate.
Yeah.
Hey, there we go.
All right.
Right. Sorry about that, folks. Hope it doesn't mess up the everyone can still see online, can they? Yeah. Hopefully, yeah. Good. Right. So I'll put this back to the start. So this is the robot platform we're using. This is Whisper. And unlike a lot of robots, it has whiskers as well as little cameras. So what it's doing here, you can see the experimental interaction. It's driven by what we call a tactile attention model. This is like a low-level motor loop. It's based on the superior flip. And what it's up to is it's pushing these sensors around, these whiskers, and trying to make contact with things in the environment. So and I'll show you a longer video of this, or it's environment, but it's driven entirely by what it can feel in its environment. So it touches something that it hasn't touched before, finds that quite interesting, orients its body, it has to follow it with its body, and uses that to navigate. So as soon as we switch it on, it engages this behaviour, and if you leave it to its own devices, push the air for a bit, realise something's there, and it just sort of start following you around if it can contact you. Otherwise, it just follow the walls and explore the whole environment. So again, inspired very heavily by whiskered mammals, so rats, prunes, voles, that sort of thing, that have these motile whiskers. Back to the slides. So okay, so that was so that's the robot we're using, and then on top of that, so that's quite the low-level sensory loop kind of in action, right? Much nicer to show than just to describe with that. For the high-level cognition, we have to take a step back to the sort of more conventional SNN technologies, but we implement a more neuroscience-inspired algorithm on it. So we've built something called a predictive coding network that can work with two different modalities of data. So we've got the tactile data coming from the robot here, from the whiskers, and then we've got the visual data coming in from its cameras. And this feeds into a network that, unlike a traditional neural network, so if you look at this, you've got this kind of pyramid shape to it, roughly, very roughly. You might think, okay, well, this is the input data, this is the input layer, and then the top is either an output layer or something, some sort of representation. The way this actually works is it starts at the top. So you start with this multimodal state of this network, and what this does is cascade that input down through weight matrices, like a normal network. But all the learning is done layer to layer. So the top layer, which is just called layer N, right at the top, right, that's multimodal. So that's trying to represent what's going on in the world, but informed by two different sensory streams. So it's got to come up with representations that can apply to and predict both. But it can't see, we're not using propagation, so it can't see the data, as it were, right? All it can see is the activity of the layer below it. So layer N can see what layer 2 is up to. It tries to predict what's happening in layer 2 in both directions. And based on that discrepancy, it gets an error signal, feeds back, adjusts the weights, and learns like that. Then layer 2 is trying to predict what layer 1 is doing, and layer 1 is trying to predict what I've sort of called layer 0, but the visual data or the tactile data is up to. So entirely based on trying to predict what your sort of the next neuron down to you is up to, you can learn how to build a working hypothesis of what is going on in the world. So the idea is the visual data and the tactile data, they'll be quite high dimensional and quite, they need condensing down. And the layer at the top is going to have a multimodal, but very kind of condensed and high level view of the world. So for example, at the lowest levels of your own sensory systems, right, you've just got detection of light on your retina, right, or the vibration of hair cells in your ear, something like that. Somewhere between that happening, that kind of energy impulse from the environment, and all the layers of your neurons, you've got this, I assume, ongoing experience of a sort of 3D world of full color, where you can hear me speaking words and not just, frequencies, right? And if you touch an object, you can detect that it's an object, you can pick something up, etc. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get this predictive coding network to condense and come up with useful representations to describe visual and tactile data that the robot might encounter. So this is the longer video that I was foreshadowing. So this is how we gather some data. So this was one of the several arenas we did in simulation. Because again, what we tended to do was have us go on a small arena, send it around, and then of course COVID hit. So then we had to take it into simulation, and simulation is always ideal. But what it did let us do was make much bigger arenas, and we can chop and change this environment as much as we want. And as you can see, Whisper's having a great time. This is very sped up because it's quite a slow robot, but it's going around, it's touching everything it can, and it's using that to guide where to go next. So eventually it will decide, yeah, there you go. So it decides to go scoop down into another environment, find something that hasn't contacted before. But this is all reactive, right? This is all reactive control. This is just gathering data based on what it finds interesting within about a 4-second window. So what we wanted to see first was, can we get a predictive coding network just by sort of observing the exploration of this robot? Can we, what will it extract? What hypotheses or what high-level variables might it extract to describe this robot's journey through the environment? And one thing we found that was very interesting, or the most interesting correlation we found, was that if you compare the representations of where the robot is and the heading of the robot, and then you compare that to the state of the network at the highest level, you do get a very strong correlation between those distances. And what this sort of implied to us was that as you change in your, so it's not quite as neat as, say, a VAE, where you can get a single neuron that you can tweak, and that will change, the representation in quite a high-level way. It's a lot more entangled than that. But you still get this relationship between where I am in the environment and what the state of my network is. And that seems to track quite reliably. So once we realized you had this relationship between what the predictive coding network was doing and where the robot is, we then wanted to look at how the actual brain of real animals represents those variables. So we represent by the 2D location of the robot, that's in a 2D arena, and also where its head is pointing at that particular time. So we started with what we thought might be the simplest, which is looking at how does brains represent head direction and what can we use for that. So just briefly to go over it. So we didn't use insects as our model, but just to kind of briefly as a sort of jumping off point. So if you look in the brain of a fly or a locust, you'll see something quite rare in nature, or quite rare in neuroscience, which is where you have because I don't know how many people in here have actually sort of seen a brain or pictures of a brain tissue, right? It does very much look like kind of, unless you have a strong background in it, it does just look like sort of amorphous, wrinkly, kind of mushroomy stuff, right? There's not an awful lot of, you can't easily identify without experiments what a particular area might do or be responsible for. But in flies and locusts, you can see a very rare correspondence between the physical structure or the physical wiring of neurons and the thing it is representing, the actual computational cognitive variable it's representing. So as you can see here, so this is a microscopy image of the neurons, and hopefully you can see it forms this ring structure, like a loose, tangled ring structure of neurons. And what this structure does, and we're measuring it experimentally, is that it has a sort of a cluster of neurons that are active when the insect it thinks its head is pointing in a particular direction in the environment, right? So it will pick an arbitrary direction as sort of 0, which might be, let's say, at the top of this ring. And then as it moves its head anti-clockwise and clockwise, that activity will track around the ring anti-clockwise and clockwise. So again, in this very special case, you can see where a cognitive variable is actually being represented inside a brain. And the variable matches the reality, the physical reality, right? So flies typically only have one head, so there's only going to be one packet of activity. And the way the inhibition works in the network is that it constrains to only move that activity a short distance around the ring. So it tracks nice and smoothly as they're sort of almost obeying the physical constraints of the fly only being able to turn its head or body at a certain rate. But of course, we're not dealing with flies, we're dealing with mammals or mammal inspired robots. So when you look at the same thing in mammals, we go back to the amorphous, mushroomy blob where there's not an obvious correspondence. But you do see a plethora of areas, which are in green, that do represent head direction or have head direction coding, as we call it in the brain. So lots of different areas you can record from will correlate with head direction, but the most basal source that if you lesion it, everything else goes away, are these two areas, which are the LMN, the lateral mammillary nuclei, and then right deep near the brainstem is the dorsal tegmental nucleus. And these two areas work together to form a kind of virtual ring or a topological ring. So they look nothing like rings under the microscope, but the connections are such that the neurons representing, say, 0 are strongly connected to the neurons representing 1 degree offset in either direction, right? And those connection strengths fall off, or the inhibition grows as you move further and further away from that neuron. So we took that and then put this into our own ring attractor model. So as you can see, arranged as a ring for everyone's convenience. So what we did with this was put together, we had a ring of excitatory cells, right, that increased the activity of what they're connected to. That was representing our ring state in blue. So wherever that kind of blue sort of Gaussian bump is, right, that's the spike rate of the neuron over time. So at the minute, whatever this neuron is, well, that's a high spike rate. It thinks that its heading is that neuron. What that represents is arbitrary. As long as the offset is tracked, the change in head direction is tracked clearly, then it works as a head direction system. And these are sort of obeying the mammalian constraints. These aren't connected to each other at all, right? These only connect to inhibitory cells that they're paired with, and these inhibitory cells then inhibit sort of inversely proportional to how far they are away in that representation. So, if this inhibitory cell, as you can see, doesn't inhibit its pair cell, its paired excitatory cell, inhibits the one left and right of it slightly. So there's a slight bias towards keeping your current direction, but there's less, you can move there. You're more allowed to move there. That's the right way to say it. But then the cell that represents, say, 180 degrees, that will be very strongly inhibited, right? There's almost no chance of the activity going from, say, this top neuron right to the bottom neuron in one go. You'll have to transition between neurons, you've got a neuron for each degree, it has to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way around the ring, rather than just flipping over in one go. And then supporting this, again, another cell type or another type of cell activity in the brain that we identified was these conjunctive cells. And these act essentially as a kind of go left, go right, or go anti-clockwise, go clockwise signal. So something in the way the visual field will change, or the tactile field, or something else, right, might indicate that my head's turning left, or sorry, my head's turning anti-clockwise, my head's turning clockwise, and these conjunctive cell pairs will try to push the activity in that direction, so anti-clockwise or clockwise. So we've got a way to stably represent head direction and a way to move it around the ring. And this was all done in the NEST simulator, right? So this is all done with spiking neurons.
It was inspired by what you observed in the real brain of...
Yeah, insects and also rats.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's where the whole ring thing comes from.
That's where the ring thing comes from, yeah.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah. The reason it's nice is because, yeah, we can actually see the physical ring and see that activity. And then, yeah, like you said, port it straight over and as you'll see, get a similar kind of behavior in simulation. So what we do, yeah, so once that was simulated as a spiking network, we then paired that up with the predictive coding network. So the one I showed you before was visual and tactile. So that was one multimodal way we did it. But there's nothing the way this network is set up. Again, it's very inspired by Cortex, right? And one of the funny facts about Cortex is that depending on what sensors you wire up to it, it will encode. You know, if you has to be done quite early in development, admittedly. But you know, if you say were to rewire what you'd normally label the visual cortex, and you were to rewire it such that you get input from the ears, it will actually become auditory cortex and start interpreting auditory signals. So in a similar vein, this predictive coding network it really doesn't care in the topology of the network what sort of information it's getting from each of those streams. All it cares about is it's got two streams it's got to predict. So we had the data from the WSCI, which was we dropped tactile for this experiment. We just said what can it see and what was its heading at various different time steps in its exploration. And we trained the predictive coding network on that. So can you predict visual from your hypothesis of what's going on in the world, which we know it can extract something to do with location? Can you predict what I should see when I'm in a particular heading? And can you predict what my heading should be when I see a particular scene, a particular view of the world? And then we would then, to test it, we would then remove that head direction input. So all you would get, we would prime it with a visual input, and this latent layer then have to try and predict, okay, where should my heading be? Or what is my heading that I would pair with this image? And that's then used, because by itself, the ring attractor, it doesn't integrate perfectly, right? There is some noise in its estimate. So what we want to do is to try and see, can we get a mapping between the visual and the head direction data such that when we see a familiar location, we can then correct any drift in that ring attractor. And so then we've got two kind of different, we've got the internal representation of the ring, like if you were to close your eyes and sort of rotate your head, right, you can roughly guess where you should be looking. But if you did that a lot, you'd get dizzy and you'd start making mistakes. And then we've got kind of the predictive coding kind of memory system from the cortex, which can apply corrections based on what it thinks you should be, where your head should be facing. Or rather, what your estimate of where your head should be is. And so once we put all that together, well, the first thing is it works, which is rather nice. So again, apologies, quite a few figures on this screen, but there's the black lines are the ground truth where it should be, and the pink lines are where the actual activity of the head direction network was. So before you get to the blue segment, right, that's before we do the occlusion, which I'll get onto in just a sec. But before that and after the occlusion, it's tracking pretty much perfectly, right? And for fairness, we did compare this to VAE, variational encoder, and a convolutional neural network, all of which can learn the problem, right? So it all can be, it's not like this is exclusive to spiking neural networks, right? It is a visual to, it's a visual to something mapping, right? So a lot of networks can do this. But one interesting thing we did, which again is based on animal studies, is we sort of rotated the cues of the environment to see whether the network would then compensate. So essentially, if you see the sort of little labels on A and B there, right, we rotated the whole environment 90 degrees, clockwise and anti-clockwise, to see how the network would kind of compensate, or whether it would compensate and whether it could adapt to that. And it did lead to some interesting differences. So you can see the predictive coding network responds quite as you would expect, right? It deviates off the ground truth by about a quarter turn, right? So it's wrong, but only because the cues have been rotated. So as its experience changes, it thinks, well, the world appears to be rotating, so where my head is facing must also be rotating, which is what we expect and what we see in animal studies. The VAE did similar, but it was a bit more sluggish. Again, so it can keep up, but it's not quite as good. The CNN was a bit of an odd case, something we never really fully got to the bottom of, which was it can do the job very well, and sometimes, under some conditions, it will track changes in the environment, but it seems to almost be too precise in its mapping, right? It doesn't have enough allowance for changes. So actually, if you rotate the cues clockwise, it actually fails to track at all. There's a slight bit of error, as you can see, but otherwise it thinks, no, nothing's moved, nothing's changed, and it just stays the course. So certainly, again, and just as a sort of open-ended thing, it does seem as though these kind of spiking or sort of spiking hybrid systems do allow for a lot of flexibility in their inputs, in a changing world. But key point, it can track theta. We can get theta into a spiking neural network. So what that then leaves is the XY component, right? So tracking location in the environment. And this relied us looking on another sort of type of cell response we find called a grid cell. So grid cells are, in some ways, another one of these, excellent areas where you can see a correspondence between a cognitive variable and the kind of the structure of the brain, the behavior of the brain. In this case, again, that's the sort of segment of brain tissue right on that far left, right? We're looking in the entorhinal cortex, sort of supporting the hippocampus. That does look like a bit of an amorphous blob again, right? There's nothing necessarily to say it does the job of predicting location, right? It isn't like a map or anything like that. But if you look at the responses of these cells, they do actually act a little bit like what they call a metric of space, right? So this is a recording taken just from a single grid cell. So in the black line here, that's what the rat was up to. Typically, scatter Rice Krispies, the rat will go and then find them all very dutifully. Covers the whole environment. And then if you record just from a single one of these grid cells, you will see this kind of, it has a preference for certain locations, right? So every one of these red dots is a spike that was recorded, overlaid onto where it was at the time. And you can see there's definitely a preference for certain locations spread throughout space, right? And they seem to tessellate, right? Triangular or hexagonal, whichever way you want to look at it. So these cells seem to be mapping almost like a certain interval in space, and along 3 axes, weirdly. So something in the brain is trying to track where you are by tracking like regular locations as they change. And it's also worth noting as well, this is just a single cell. If you expand this to look at, say, all grid cells, you'll see both a kind of, if you imagine kind of copy and pasting that template in all 3 directions, right? The grid cells cover all space, but they also cover it at different scales. So some might have huge fields, but are spaced very infrequently. And the idea, our sort of current hypothesis is if you combine all those together, you can then get a very, very large area represented, and potentially also it would help you encode memories, unique memories for unique locations. So, based on an idea from Burgess, we thought, well, we know these rings exist in biology. We also have a working ring model. So it seems evolution can get a ring attractor working in the brain. The jury's still out on exactly what structure or what connectivity is used to generate the grid cells. So we thought, well, is it possible that the entorhinal cortex is using rings as ring attractors, or 3 ring attractors, 1 per each axis, to make these kind of grid cell responses? So what we did, rather than giving it information as to how information as to how the head was turning and feeding that to the rings, instead for this experiment, or this series of experiments, we fed it information on its velocity, but proportional to one of those 3 axes. So the more aligned it was with an axis, the higher that was weighted. and then we gave it some information about the velocity change of the robot. If we fed those components to each ring, you would get sort of stripe cells generated, which is another sort of response you can see in the real brain, where it will track movement in one direction, but kind of irrespective of movement in any other direction. So as you can see, regular spaced lines, it will respond anywhere if you deviate along that axis or displace along that axis enough. If you then combine 3 of those together with a further cell that now we're sort of calling a grid cell, that only responds when all 3 of these cells are active, then lo and behold, you do get a grid cell response. Right? So just to recap, so each of these stripe responses are coming from a single cell on one of these rings. If you have a grid cell that talks to 3 cells, 1 on each ring, you will get a kind of metric of space being mapped, which can tell you where the robot is in spikes. So again, does it work? Well, once you put all that together, so this is the 3 rings modeling location together as a trio, their activity being represented in green, so that's what the actual state of the ring is, which neuron is firing when, or sort of what its spike rate is at any given time. You've then got the recall injections, which come in from the predictive coding network, which was also trained on this data. So that's going to correct for any drift that accumulates as the ring state moves around. And working together, you can not only can you track 2D location, as you can see on the left figure at the bottom. So the blue is the ground truth, and the green is the what the rings think they're up to. So not mapping the exact location, but mapping the changes in location very, very well. And you can get a further gain in accuracy by recalling memories, right, as to what the rings were up to when you last had a certain visual experience. So the robot, is journeying around for a while. Eventually, just due to its exploration, it comes back to a prior location. It sees something that looks very similar. That triggers a recall response that injects energy to where what neuron was most active on those rings at that time. And then, so this is a very small segment of a very large data set. But hopefully that illustrates the point that you can get a spiking ring-based localization system using a simulated model and also this predictive coding mechanism. Then just as the last point, and I can take some questions, one thing that fell out of this that is potentially this might be where we next go with this work, is that over a certain domain, so each of these, I told these right at the start, these are current-based models, right? You can feed them a certain amount of current to make them spike faster or slower. Depending on how much current you allow the ring to use, you do get this rather nice trade-off between the accuracy of the ring, i.e., lower is better on this graph. So the accuracy of the ring, you can reduce the error just by feeding the ring more current up to a certain point, and then it starts to get a bit haywire. Right, so I sort of hoped this trend would go on a lot longer than it did, but within a certain window, and without really optimizing or refining the network to show this behavior, you do get this nice trade-off between how much energy you're consuming, so it's about sort of a 2-fold, 3-fold increase in energy usage, for a small but significant reduction in error. And why this is nice for robotics is because, well, first of all, in a real animal, right, depending on your metabolic state, you need to minimize energy or increase your energy use depending on what you're trying to do and how satiated you are and when food's available. So that's a nice nod to biology. But also for robotics, if you want robots that are, so these networks are already quite low power, but if you want a robot that is out, in the wild really, really long term, you're probably going to have to start making trade-offs between how accurate or how much energy you're going to use versus your continued longevity doing whatever it is you're doing. So so just a final little aside, basically, that's another thing, just one more thing that came out of that research, potentially will lead to some interesting stuff in the future. Other than that, then, great. Thank you very much for your time. And happy to take any questions.
Hi. That was great. I was just wondering if the ring attractors that we're using for the grid cell stuff is, firstly, are they also spiking? And secondly, do they have the same structure as the original head direction ring attractor?
Yeah. No, thank you, Rachel. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So are they the same as the previous ones? There was a slight modification, but I think pretty much in most ways they were very, very similar. I think we changed. The one thing we did change was that rather than having, it's quite specific with the work we did, but rather than the excitatory cells being intrinsically excitable, we had a baseline excitation from the conjunctive cells, which I think it was just. I don't think we were sure at the time whether these cells were intrinsically excitable or not, and so we just thought, well, that's a good source of tonic activity. Sorry, second part of your question. Were they spiking? Yes, they were spiking. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to put the two bits together, right? Because all the stuff about the ring attractors, which are kind of like centroids, and I totally believe that you can get a good encoding of the two-dimensional space by hooking them together. That all makes perfect sense. Because you could do that without spiking neurons, right? You could do it with an analog system.
Yes.
So, well, what are the spiking neurons doing for you here?
Yeah, like sort of as a what benefit do you get sort of technically? Yeah.
What's the value of that?
So you brought up analog already, so that's maybe this point won't apply, but I'm thinking the one thing that I think you can always rely on with neuromorphics is that the power consumption is incredibly low. I don't know if it would beat an analog system, to be honest. But
that's the power.
I would say it's mostly power consumption, because you can leaving aside it's nice to be close to neuroscience, and we can use that as an inspiration for further developments and all that stuff. In terms of like raw technical benefit, it's sort of longevity, power consumption, also robustness, I would say as well. You get a lot of devices collectively performing that computation. If you knock a few of them out, it doesn't massively degrade the performance. So if you're in an area with, say, high cosmic rays or something, or you've got some reason to think maybe it will be thermally unstable or something, maybe that would be superior.
That's not being my question.
Okay, that's all right.
Because Thomas Nawani, he always kind of says, it's obvious it's spiking neurons, it's going to be less power, right?
Yeah.
And you think, why is that? And it's never really clearly explained. It seems to be it's going to be less power consumption, because a lot of the time the spiking neurons are not spiking. They're just sitting there, not consuming any power. But they will be consuming power because they've got to be doing that integration.
Yes.
So it's really unclear why spiking neurons should necessarily be less power hungry.
Yeah, I think it's one of those systems that's there will definitely be probably many cases where their sort of baseline power consumption is going to be more than you would want, even just with, like you said, very intermittent spikes. But I think the cool thing about spiking systems is that you can get like very, very sparse encodings of certain things. So once you scale up to sort of hundreds of thousands of neurons, which admittedly is a bit of a pipe dream, because of course simulating all of that with enough detail can be quite difficult and getting sort of data out. But once you scale it up, the low power consumption helps it scale very nicely. But then I would say add in that robustness and the real sort of heterogeneity of response you can get from having like 1,000 or 100,000 units all trying to respond to a stimulus. Because, for example, where is it? A couple of slides back, I think. Yeah. So if you look at this, these obviously these are real neurons, so it doesn't quite apply. But the grid cells, as you can see, it's not a perfect, perfect metric, perfect tracking like the simulation version. And one of the reasons a lot of people think that is because these aren't just responding to spatial things; these are responding to sort of non-spatial stimuli as well. And the reason we don't find more grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, because I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head. I think it's like 30%, is it? can't remember. Basically, if you look at the entorhinal cortex, you don't find every cell is not a grid cell by far, but that's only because we're looking for them by tracking location and whether this neuron is spiking. So obviously, there's always the question: okay, well, what else could the brain? The brain could be responding to another sensor. It could be responding to another part of the brain that's doing a separate computation that we haven't disentangled yet either. So when you've got, say, 100,000 spiking neurons, they can be looking at not just where you are, but where you are plus what you're looking at or what you're hearing. They found grid cells that respond to, well, grid cells that are in the same vicinity that respond to things like the timing of certain experiments, satiation levels and things like that. So you can gather a huge amount of data and do useful things with it. But because of the low power, you can scale quite well. That would be my pitch anyway. So whether it works out that way. Sorry, there's a question back, is it?
Thanks, Ashley, for speaking so much. I was also going to ask about what you're getting from spiking, because it seems like the predictive coding networks doing the heavy lifting, and that would be implemented just as well in a grid-based model as spiking paradigm.
No, quite right. I mean, the predictive coding network itself, maybe I didn't trust us enough. That was actually put on TensorFlow anyway.
Right.
So actually, that's just an ANN sort of assisting it.
Right.
I think it's still it's by no means clear cut. I don't want to pretend it is. It's still very much an ongoing thing. I'm curious when you've got, like, say, artificial neural networks where they're kind of, let's say, they're massive head start, especially in terms of the theory is about the same age, but in terms of like the actual hardware that you deploy it onto and all the frameworks that you can use to accelerate that. I think give neuromorphics, say, 15 years, it'll be interesting to see whether they've caught up some of that ground, and there is actually a clear winner in that area.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to see the use of spiking neural networks having staked a reasonable chunk of my career on them being run. But yeah. I think perhaps the argument that might say we've had this a bit better is if you could show you've achieved the same result not by having a small farm of GPUs strapped to the back of your robot, but by a small neuromorphic system on board, which then leads to the power efficiency arguments.
Yeah.
I think that's the key benefit of their use here. But I could see one in a purely computational sense. With unlimited resources.
Oh right, yeah. Remove the resource constraint. Yeah, I think it's that there isn't really a brilliant contest at the minute. Yeah, right. Yeah, there's another group in the lab that's working with the Loihi directly, which I didn't really have. It wasn't really what they do wasn't quite relevant to this, but hopefully we'll see a few BRL and obviously loads of other places. Hopefully we'll be coming out with those kind of neuromorphic based applications in the next couple of years. Fingers crossed. Yeah. I think you're next.
So I'm thinking, I mean, as much as I like the whole predictive coding idea of just autonomously finding explanations for structure and sensory detail, I'm always wondering how much the success of these methods depends on cleverly designing your, either topology or your architecture or the anatomy, if you talk about biology. The network to have this work in a way that finds this parsimonious explanations to your data. And I mean, you mentioned in the beginning, like deep learning and all this stuff. There is a lot of human intelligence going through by putting in the right data. And I'm wondering with coding and other bio-inspired methods, whether we are just shifting it more towards cleverly designing the circuits that support this. I mean, for example, with the ring topology. I mean, it really enjoy looking at it. I'm just wondering, like, I guess in some sense, when designing this, what you had in mind was, okay, I want to represent an angle or something.
I want to build a ring, so I'm gonna build a ring. Yeah, I know what you mean. That's a very good point. Yeah, and I think it's something always to be careful about when stating how close we are to the neurobiology. Yeah, definitely, because in our heads this has all been done either developmentally or through lifetime learning. Yeah. So yeah, I think the way we justified it was that the ring attractor seems to be quite it's a structure you can find in nature, kind of sort of pre-built. So it seems as though, and I believe it's there kind of quite early in the development of flies, I believe. Maybe going out on a limb there slightly, but so this structure does seem to be reachable by a kind of pre-wired, quote unquote, developmental method. So that's kind of how we justified hand building the ring. There have been papers, and I'm kicking myself because I can't remember the name. There have been bits of work that show you can get kind of ring attractor structures will develop kind of, if you just train like arbitrary connected networks, you will get kind of ring activity falling out of them. If you yeah, that sort of thing, exactly. You know, exactly. If you map all the spikes, you get a ring, or you get a torus or something. Yeah, exactly. But no, to your point, yeah, definitely, it's always something to be aware of. And yeah, hopefully over time we'll get more kind of where we can kind of almost like grow these networks from a very simple template and see these structures emerge naturally. So I think the question, yeah, I'll let you first and then get back.
Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, kind of following on from the last point about inductive biases, because essentially you're trying to do predictive coding or auto coding. You know, the only way to get semantically meaningful latent features is to introduce some inductive biases like you've done with the features. I mean, it can kind of fall out if, if you're lucky and the data is structured in a particular way, but typically it doesn't unless you structure your system in some way.
Yeah.
But this brings me on to the question about, you described you have two types of data. You have tactile data, or image data, or you have image data, angle direction. Can you tell us about the error function? Because this is also an inductive bias. How do you measure your distance to the center sequence?
Right. Yes. So are you talking about the error between the direction you're at and the desired direction? Is that what you mean?
And the image and the whisper data as well.
I believe it just mean squared error for the whole thing. I think we just
trying to regress pixel values.
In a sense, yeah. But
okay, so
yeah.
Okay. So you're directly regressing the input pixels with no pre-processing at all.
No, yeah, no convolutions, nothing like that. No, there have been. So Shirindora, who put the original, not the multi-century, but the original kind of pregnant architecture together. I know his group's done some work with adding convolutions in, which of course then the problem is then if you run it backwards, of course everything's all coming out convoluted. It's a bit hard to kind of get that nice reconstruction like you would. You have to do some sort of, you have to augment it somehow. But yeah, no, the pixels all just went in as one flattened layer. There was no pre-processing at all. They do come out fairly blurry, as you'd expect from that. But in terms of, because we were looking at the representations and we were looking at, say, correlation, these are very, like you said, very entangled representations. But the fact that they were correlate, they could be used as a signature of where you are, was enough for the ring system.
So you to a spectral bias from the kinds of frequencies described, like image frequencies.
Right.
So you end up, because it's a smooth reconstruction, you're going to see low frequency.
Right. Yeah.
You don't get hard edges.
Yeah.
And for the angle, what error function did you use?
So what are we trying to do now? So what we would do with the angle is we would put I think we tried with Gaussian and Laplacian. We would get the response back, we'd smooth it. And I think we went for Laplacian in the end. And then we would feed that in essentially, like you mentioned, we kind of unwrap the ring and we'd feed that in as, I think it was 100, it was depending on the size, but 180 neurons, I think, in the final one. And then that would be like the unwrapped ring, the state of that. And then we just roll that signal around. So if you start here, you end the other side. And that was, I'm pretty sure it's just, I think it just means squared error again for that. So it would kind of like try and just grow and match that Laplacian over time. Cool. Yeah, I think I have a question there.
I was wondering, in terms of talking about combining two sensory modalities, do you think if you're combining more sensory modalities, thinking about how the canvas works in the actual brain, then that would reduce the kind of error in terms of like place representation? Presumably that high enough, then you're kind of approaching something which is a place representation, so at least a place cell, but
in a sort of a bit more kind of 3D as it were, or full color sort of quote unquote. You add in more sensors, you get more idea of where you are. Was that sort of what you're getting at? Yeah. I mean, a slide I originally had in, but I did cut it for time, was showing the difference between having multi-sensory, visual, and tactile solo. And unfortunately, for our sort of whiskers are great, we love whiskers. Actually, tactile didn't make it worse, but it didn't make it significantly better adding that in. And we think that's partly because we dropped the ball a bit on the tactile richness of the environment. So although it had two kinds of, say, blocks in the environment, and it had the walls of various shapes and such, there just isn't really enough. It's very difficult to represent tactile, like all that collision data can get quite sort of expensive to calculate, because you've got 64 whiskers that are all going to collide every couple of seconds, right? So there's a lot of, it slows the simulation down quite a lot. So we did, I think, how we added more richness in, we would have hopefully seen a gain in that. One of the issues is, of course, that vision's really, really good for localization. So if you start with vision, it's hard to find something that will augment it sufficiently for it to be significant.
Well, yeah, I mean, auditory acoustics can be amazing for head direction in particular.
Right, because you can
hear that.
You can tell the delay. Yeah, the delays. Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. We haven't tried auditory actually. Mainly because Robo doesn't have ears. But yeah, no, it's a good point. I think it's interesting to try.
Yeah, I was wondering how concerned you are about sticking close to the biology as well. Obviously, it's inspired. I know about more evidence specifically for like the ring attractors for head direction, but I don't think as far as the grid cells go, that's for conjecture, right?
With the rings, yes. So there's the things like the I think it was Burgess, oscillatory interference model. It sort of puts forward that you've got three kind of activity patterns that intersect. Doesn't necessarily state whether they're grids or not. Although I'm pretty sure the paper does have a sketch of a ring, excuse me. So it's not without precedent, but yes, it is sort of conjecture on our part. That so this is possible, and we're like, okay, we know the structure is this, like you said, we know this is this in biology. If you were to combine three of them, it is kind of plausible that this could generate a grid signal. If the brain followed that path, I mean, I suppose it could even be different in different species, whether that was co-opted or not. But yeah, that is just conjecture on our part. This model.
Taking that as a model is more efficient than trying to design some kind of network architecture or spiking on it. To do the same functions that we're saying.
So a lot of in the experimentally on the biology.
Arbitrarily design.
No, definitely. In fact, something that's again gaining a bit of traction in the lab is this idea. So with the Loihi chip, there's a okay, now I'm going to get the two mixed up. There's something called, I think it's called lava for Loihi. And if it's not it is lava. I was going to say, is that or Slayer? I always get them two mixed up. So yeah, lava lets you build an artificial network with sort of, like you said, arbitrary dimensions, complexity. Train it all nicely using the GPU, and then just port it all over to neuromorphics, and then you get kind of the benefits of both worlds. Which for me, I mean, that's a bit sacrilegious, because suddenly you're breaking that lovely link. But definitely, if you just want the power efficiency, I suspect that will probably be at least the path of least resistance for getting these things kind of working in industry, and for like embedded applications. So, yeah, that's right.
So you used PCM partly because you can sidestep that propagation.
Yes.
Kind of murky issues about biological plausibility of that for them. But if you're using spiking effects, you could take that further still, right? So you could use STP, for instance, to more biologically grounded. But just occurred to me as a more common question in one direction in which you could bang the drum for the usefulness.
No, thank you. No, exactly. That's a very good point. Yeah, it would be nice to explore that, see if it carries over. We haven't, no. It went to grid cells. No. Would love to. Cyril Penart's with Sheeran, I think they finally got it working, or they've got some very early model of it working. Amsterdam, last I heard. But yeah, so yeah, no, would love to look into that. It'd be good. Full spiking everywhere.